Welcome back, everybody. This is Danny Leonard, one of the co-founders of Ramp Careers. I'm here with my other two co-founders, Mitch and Manoj. And today we want to talk to you about a juicy topic that's on everybody's mind with the COVID crisis, and that is how to ace your interview. But before we jump into that, there's some news of the day that we all wanted to talk about. It looks like the federal government is working on an aggressive timeline to remove college degrees as a minimum qualification or requirement for most federal jobs. Manoj, I know that you've spoken about this in the past. What do you think of that action by the federal government?
I think it's a good move, Danny. I don't know if college degrees are functional or necessary anymore. There's just been so much chat about how colleges are expensive, student loans are becoming increasingly a big crisis. And so the move, in my view, is for the better. I've enjoyed the time that I've spent at college. So on the one hand, I think it's a good idea. On the other hand, I'm not quite sure if I would have traded my time in college and have entered the workforce right away. But it's not to say that it could be an option for some people.
Frankly, I don't think it's necessary for folks to have a college degree to succeed, specifically in the sales arena. Some of the best performing salespeople I've seen have taken jobs that are not even close to their major. Somebody jumping from sports management background or a kinesiology background or even a social sciences background and coming in and rocking out on the sales front. I'm more than happy to take a unseasoned, unpolished high school graduate that's super hungry, ready to make money, and wants to succeed and win, and train them up and get them into a high performance job. And I know, Mitch, you work with tons of salespeople. What do you think of this action and how it impacts the hiring front?
I agree. I think it can work for sure. I don't think college is necessarily a requirement. I guess my hesitation is the infrastructure there, right? What does the process look like for vetting these folks, right? College is a great screener. It automatically disqualifies folks for a couple of reasons, but it shows that folks can go through 4 years of school and put in a good effort and come out the other side. So can you do that from a single test and qualify someone? That's kind of the open question, especially for a high stake government job. That being said, we're seeing it being done in some other industries. We're seeing a lot of engineering schools pop up specifically for software engineering. We're seeing it in sales for sure right now. I think it can be done. It may take some time for everything to click. And I don't know how willing some employers are going to be to switch over and immediately start hiring folks with no college degrees.
Yeah, those are both good points. I do see the college as a screener being an important factor. Hey, look, they're qualified at this level. Now we can trust them to take the next step. The one thing that is open for me is, flash forward 20 years, are folks still paying $100,000 a year for college? And is that attainable for the vast majority of people in this country? Can they afford to go to college? And is that still the most relevant screener? Or is it something else, something like a technical school or a certification program, something like that?
For sure. College is a credentialing program. It gives you that badge or that certificate that, you pass that test. Could you do it another way? For sure. And yeah, will it be affordable for most folks in the future? Maybe not. So I think it's possible, but it's probably a long road ahead.
Nice. So on to our core topic of the day, which is how to ace that all-important interview. So Manoj, I know that you've spoken broadly about the topic of acing your sales interview. Tell me about your philosophy when it comes to the sales interview or an interview in general.
Yeah, it's a tricky topic because for the longest time, and I've been through my fair share of interviews, and starting out, I did what everybody else did, looked up online, prepped for some types of questions that are commonly asked, had responses that were baked into my head. And my perspective was, I walk into a room, I get asked some questions, I'm going to answer those questions, I'm going to leave, right? And so most of them ended up being Q&A, discussion type events, and I didn't really feel like I left a memorable impression on most folks. And then when I was asked, do you have any questions, I had my standard set of questions that I would throw at them, and it seemed like a very scripted process. And That was what was taught to me. That was what I read online. And then as time progressed and as that, didn't yield the type of results that I wanted it to yield, I decided to switch it up and treat them the way that I would treat any other interesting, engaging conversation that I have with people, understanding that it's still a formal setting and understanding that it's an opportunity for me to learn about the company and for the company to learn about me. So the shift in my attitude happened when I look back at some of the good interviews that I've had and ask myself, why is it that some interviews were more memorable than the others? And the answer, the common theme among all of these interviews that went well was that I tended to share more stories. A lot of these interviews were driven by me storytelling. And that made all the difference, because what started out as being scripted Q&A type conversations changed into organic discussions between two people that happened to be in a room that were also interested in each other.
Nice. And Mitch, I know that you have not only been on the interviewer side, you've also been the interviewee side of several interviews as well. Talk to me a bit about the power of storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think like Manoj said, it's super important to be able to tell a good story as you're going through these questions, right? You don't want to just answer with a quick one-liner back to one of these questions. This is your chance to sell yourself, to demonstrate all of your qualities that are going to make you a great candidate and a great salesperson. And to do that, you have to get the interviewer to feel and live in that moment with you. So whether that's about, a challenge you faced or an accomplishment that you've had over your career, you really need to bring that out through a story, and you need to set the story up right. I think Manoj has a great framework for how to lay the foundation for a story, how to introduce the issue, and then tie it back to the resolution, which is key, because what you want to show them is, here's the challenge I faced and here's how I solved it. This is why I'm going to be a great employee. This is why I'm going to be a great salesperson. This is why I'm going to be a great fill in the blank, because I can overcome challenges. I can solve them. You want to show those traits. And because they haven't ever experienced your life with you, you need to tell a story about it to get them to feel it. Manoj, you probably could go into some clarity around the actual framework that I think you like to teach people.
Yeah, so I spoke with a few writers, and I spoke with a few folks that were in the entertainment business, and the questions for them was, well, how do you go about developing a story? And through that process, learned that there are some common themes when it comes to storytelling. Any good story has a premise. Premise just sets up context for folks that are listening to you. A story also has a plot, some series of events that ties characters to some kind of a main objective. A good story has some characters. If it's just you, not really sure if it makes for a really good story. A story has some other characters around you. And probably the most important piece of a good story is some kind of a conflict and some kind of a resolution. You have to build anticipation, and you have to find a way to draw the listener's attention into your story, and having a conflict and having a way that you resolve the conflict is the way you build up that anticipation. And then there needs to be an underlying theme, and be subtle about it. Most good stories have some kind of an underlying theme that a writer or a storyteller doesn't scream what the theme is at every single opportunity. It's a very subtle note that flows throughout the story. And so when you're trying to explain, tell me about a time when this happened, or when you're trying to answer, what is your experience with why, you may already have some stories in your mind. Just thinking about structuring them in the right way and practicing the delivery of it makes a lot of difference.
And I think it's what Manoj said there a second ago is really important. Right, you're demonstrating that trait that you want to come across. So if the interviewer says, "Tell me about your leadership traits," you can't just say back, "I'm a good leader," or you can't just say back, "I was the captain of my football team in high school." That doesn't tell them much about you as a leader. So if we maybe be helpful if we even ran through a quick example with Manoj's framework there. If the question was, "Tell me about your leadership qualities," or "Tell me about how you've led a team in the past," you can set it up with the premise being, it was my junior year of high school, I was voted co-captain of the football team, right? There's your premise, there's your plot. We went into this season with a young team, with almost no senior leadership. So I really had to step up to the plate. You're starting to set the stage for what's going to happen. Throw in some other characters there. The coach was counting on me, and I was leading the team of 60 folks that were looking for a winning season out of us. Now, the conflict resolution is important, right? How can you overcome a conflict and resolve and take action to come out on the other end? And maybe in this case, it's, look, we went down 4-5 record. We were trying to make it into the playoffs. We needed to get our last win or our last 2 wins of the season to make it into the playoffs. And we ended up staying after practice every day to watch film and to focus on our technique in order to get better. And that can be your story for how you were a good leader and pulled the team through that tough time. And then that itself tells a story of leadership instead of you just blatantly stating, I'm a good leader, or I've been a captain of this, or I've led this team. Now you're showing those qualities through that story framework. And like Manoj said, you have all these stories in your head already. It's just structuring them so that the person on the other side can clearly follow and clearly see what you're trying to tell them.
I really like that. I like the framework. I like the arc of the story and how you can apply it to the actual interview. It's bringing back, given thousands of sales interviews at this point in time in my life, it's bringing me back to one of the absolute best SDR interviews that I ever sat through. It was an SDR at a previous company I worked at, a company called Thanks. The SDR that came in, her name was Molly, and I asked this one question on every SDR interview, and it's, tell me about a time where you overcame some adversity. And I purposely leave it very open-ended so that folks can fill in the blanks with that story. Some SDRs will come in and just say something like, yeah, I got an F on my first test in college, and then I tried my butt off, and then I got an A, which is great, I think. But everybody can relate to that. Almost everybody has failed a test, and that is difficult. I'm not taking anything away from it, but that doesn't really show perseverance against some odds. Molly came in and said, hey, look, I was a rising junior on my basketball team. I was having a great season. I tore my ACL and thought I wasn't going to play again. I ended up battling back, doing the rehab. And the next year I was voted captain of my team. And in one of the games, I ended up setting the record for 3-pointers made. Now that story has exactly all of the elements, and it wasn't structured in my head back in the day because I didn't have this framework necessarily, but this is a great way to kind of put that into a little capsule and say, hey, look, here's the conflict, here's the arc, here's the win. And now as the interviewer sitting on the other side, I'm thinking, okay, I can trust that this person can get it done because they've faced this crazy challenge in the past and now can apply it to the sales job or apply it to their next role. So that's super interesting. And I think it's a framework that anybody can use and apply to any role, not just a sales role. Switching gears a little bit, what are some of the key questions that you think you'll get asked or folks typically get asked in an interview? And what are some of the best ways to answer them outside of the story arc?
I think you'll always hear right off the bat, tell me about yourself and why sales. Those will probably be one of the first 2 or 3 questions out of the interviewer's mouth. Tell me about yourself. You need to practice that in front of the mirror. Rehearse it 20 times a day until you know it cold. And it should be about 60 to 120 seconds long, framing up where you've been, where you are now, and where you want to go. You don't need to ramble about your childhood best friend, but give them a little color of who you were growing up, what you're doing right now, and where you want to head in the future. And then why sales, again, will definitely be one of the first 2 or 3 questions. That can be a little personal for each individual, but I think you need to remember one thing in your head is you're selling the interviewer on yourself. Mm-hmm. This is an interview, but it's a sales interview. You're in there to sell yourself against the other candidates next to you. You need to make them see why sales is the end all be all for you. Why is it important for you now? Why is it going to be your career path long term? That being said, doesn't mean that you're going to have to stick with sales for the next 50 years. You can always switch your career down the road. But in that moment, the interviewer needs to believe that you're all in on sales.
And I've always considered telling me about yourself as, why should I hire you? Never really, it's a good way of reframing the question, because at the end of the day, yeah, they want to hear about you, but they're hiring you for a job. And so tying it back to, even if you have absolutely no experience and the only thing that you've done is graduated from a 4-year degree, there's still a way to answer that question, perhaps by saying, I'm a recent graduate from this school where I had 2 jobs and aced every single semester. And if there's anything that I want you to know about me, it's that I'm hardworking and I love sales. So, turn it around and then maybe jump into why they should hire you. I think this is an opportunity, a failed opportunity for many folks, because that sets the tone for the interview, the very first question. And if you go down the path of sharing your life history, it falls flat, and it's just not a fun process. So I think those are 2 standard questions. I think folks also ask people about what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. I would encourage using stories to answer that question, as opposed to listing out, I'm a hard worker, I like to see good results. Well, I mean, who doesn't? No one's going to come in there and say, I'm a lazy person, right? And so not memorable. And the challenge is that oftentimes with these SDR interviews, Danny, I don't know what your experience is, but when we had interviewed them, these were back to back. I mean, we were interviewing 8, 9 candidates. It's so hard to tell one from the other, and it's a tough job to interview so many people. And I think it's so important to be memorable. And anything that you can do, especially in this economy, which quite honestly, not the best, any effort to be memorable will yield phenomenal results.
Danny, you've seen more than anyone. Tell us, what are the questions that you like to ask?
I was just going to say, I have seen days where I've interviewed 10 straight SDRs, and I agree that's the vibe is I want to feel the hunger out of somebody. But the questions that I love asking, one is, give me 3 words to describe you as a worker, as a person. And I like to hear things like, tell me about a time where you received some constructive feedback and how you applied that to your life. So the answer I like to hear is some time where they took a negative experience, got coached up, applied it, and came out on top of the other side. So an example of this is I gave an interview a couple of years back to a college basketball player. She was the leading point scorer for her team. And her coach came to her one day after practice and said, hey, look, I know you're great at scoring. The team really counts on you to score. However, I do think the team would improve much more if you also pass the ball a little bit more. Your teammates have complained to me on some certain instances. They're a little bit afraid to approach you directly. So she took that to heart. She was actually super disappointed. She didn't realize her teammates felt that way. She took it to heart, though. And for the next 4 games, she led the team in assists and actually didn't score a point in any of those games, and proved it to herself and to her teammates that she could be an unselfish player. They ended up winning all 4 of those games. Now, that was a story where took the direct feedback, applied it to her life, and came out on top. But sports, when you get an athlete in an interview, that they have examples of this. And that's why a lot of salespeople do tend to come from athletics backgrounds or sporting backgrounds, because they just know how to improve. They have that self-determination, that competitive spirit. So another question I have is about current interview format. So as we all know, interviews are happening over Zoom, virtually based. I want to know how COVID has impacted the interview experience and what some best practices are for interviews during COVID. So Mitch, what have you seen in this avenue?
A couple of things to note. So I think we're seeing more casual interviews. We're seeing more casual life experiences in general, right? I think on the interviewing side, it's a little bit more casual. You're not going to the office. You're not necessarily, especially in the tech world, you're probably not putting a suit on. But that doesn't mean that you're laying in your pajamas in bed eating Cheerios, right? So one way that you can easily differentiate yourself is to come prepared and come polished on the interview setting, right? We're sitting here on Zoom. You won't be wearing a hat like I am now. You won't probably be sitting on your couch. Find a nice desk chair to sit at, clean yourself up, take a shower, put a nice collared shirt on or appropriate wear for who you're talking with, and then test your equipment first, right? One of the worst things you can do is show up 4 or 5 minutes late because you couldn't download your Zoom or your Google Hangouts plugin. Go on there, make sure everything's downloaded, ready to go. Show up 10 minutes early and make sure you're ready to go before the interviewer gets on there so that you don't have any technical difficulties. Test your headphones, make sure they're charged, make sure you're in a quiet space. All those little things can make or break an interview, right? If you're sitting here and breaking up over the line and they can't hear a single answer, not going to be a good experience for anybody on the line. So that's definitely two of the biggest things, right? Is things are definitely a little bit more casual, but you can differentiate yourself a little bit by going above and beyond, or at least just showing up like a clean human, and then make sure your technology works, because that's going to be a disaster and it's going to stress you out, and it's not going to leave a good impression if anything goes wrong there.
Yeah, that's great insights. One of my biggest pet peeves this day and age for interviews that happen over Zoom is when the person jumps on and has a bad Wi-Fi connection or can't connect. There are just so many ways to connect to the virtual meeting today, whether it's a phone call or whether it's truly your Wi-Fi went out, and so many ways to connect. There should be no excuse. And like you said, the headset charge, test your system before. There's no reason for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's just problem solving 101, right? And if you can't pass that simple test of getting on a Zoom meeting, you might not be a good fit.
Yeah, keeping the cameras on is something that you just must do if it's a video interview. If it's on the phone, that's one thing, but it's simply not good posture when you're interviewing with 2-3 people. Typically, a lot of these video interviews are 2-on-1, 3-on-1, and everyone else has their camera on. Unless you have a very compelling reason as to why you shouldn't, I think you should. The advantage is that you're in familiar settings. You're interviewing, within the comfort of your own home, and I think it makes a huge difference in terms of easing your nerves. The disadvantage is that it's very hard to read cues, especially physical cues and body language, even if you have your camera on. So you have to rely on your voice for the most part. Voice modulation is the only tool that you have to convey emotions for the vast majority of time. And so I think it's important to slow down, speed up, pause, and use every voice modulation trick that you have in your book to engage with people, because otherwise monotone is not really good on video conference calls. It can get a little bit tough.
I think along those lines, I agree with Manoj. You miss a lot of those cues in the room. You also miss some attention, possibly, right? Because now the interviewer is sitting in front of their laptop, he or she, they've got emails coming in, they've got other stuff that may be going on. In order to grab their attention, in order to keep them engaged, you, one, need to be telling good stories like we've been talking about, but two, actually engage them, ask them questions. It doesn't have to be one-sided. Don't wait for them to ask you a question and you ramble for 5 minutes. Throw those questions back at them, or get to know them as a person and as a potential employer, but also get to dig into the actual meat of what the company does, what the role entails. Like Manoj said earlier, the best interviews he's ever had are ones that feel like a natural flowing conversation. And the easiest way to get someone's attention is to ask them a question, get them talking. That gets them out of their email inbox or Facebook, wherever they might be distracted in this digital age.
Yeah, don't ask yes or no questions. They're not interesting, right? Storytelling cuts both ways. People want to listen to stories, and people also love sharing stories. And so ask questions that will elicit a story from the other person, because then they'll feel like they've shared a bit of themselves with you, and they'll feel like they've also had a voice during the interview process. And so, typically questions such as, are there opportunities for me to go up the ladder at this company, is probably one of the stupidest questions that you can ask in an interview. I mean, what company is going to tell you no? We will want you to be forever an entry-level SDR. It's just it's not really a question, right? So don't ask it.
That's a good segue to the last question I have, which is what are those questions? Like, what is a good question to ask? It's something that comes up in every interview. Yeah, the last question you're asked is, what questions do you have for me? What are the questions we should ask?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a few, and then Danny, I'm sure you can add as well. One of the things that I ask is I'll look up to see if the people that you're interviewing with, what's their background? Have they been with the company for a while? And if they have, I will ask them, hey, it looks like you've been here for 3 years. It looks like you've risen up the ranks. Talk to me about, your history here. It's not very often that you see people rising up the ranks as quickly as you do. How did that happen, right? And so that's a question that's kind of open-ended, and it will give them an opportunity to share what's worked for them and what's not worked for them. It's also a good question to ask in general, right? I mean, you want to know what success looks like for that role in this company. And so I think that's a good question to ask.
That's great. A few that I really like, especially if you're coming into an entry-level sales role. One is, tell me about what makes a successful SDR at company X. That one is open-ended. It shows me that you're interested in succeeding. It shows me that you're hungry and driven. And it also shows me that you want to win, succeed, and grow at this company. So I love that question. Another way to spin this is, I've done my research. I know who you are on LinkedIn. I know the cues that are available to me online. I'm going to ask you something specific about your background and how you took it to this company. So a good example of that would be, I'm just going to use my background is, if somebody looks me up on LinkedIn, they can obviously see that I went to the University of Michigan and most likely very proud of that. And if they're going to check out my background and say something about Michigan, like, hey, look, I saw that you went to the Ross School of Business. Tell me about how you brought some of those skills that you learned there into the workforce. That shows me that they not only care about what I do at this company, but they looked me up, they've done their research, they know who I am, they know my presence online, and I can tell that they, didn't just kind of shoot from the hip on the questions in the interview. Probably 55 to 60% of folks that just come into an interview unprepared and just shoot from the hip with questions out of seemingly nowhere. And that's a dead giveaway that they're not super interested in the role.
Yeah, I think context matters too, right? Asking the right questions to the right people. Remember who you're interviewing with. If you're interviewing with, let's say it's a smaller size company and you're interviewing with the CEO or the founder, I think it's okay to ask questions about, why they founded the company, where they see the market going, and it's to reserve the more, tactical questions on prospecting or messaging to a director of sales or an SDR manager, right? So, just remember who your audience is and how they spend most of their day. Ask them questions that, they'll find interesting, that may relate to your role as an SDR, but, just remember the audience too, because again, asking a question that someone may not be in the best position to answer is not going to get you, too appealing a response.
Yep. That's great. I think that's all the time we have for today. We'll be back tomorrow with another meaty topic for discussion. From Mitch, Manoj, and I, this is Danny signing off from the Ramp Careers Daily Update. Thanks, everybody. See you later.